Hello and welcome to the News9 Global Summit Show. We are counting down to our biggest and boldest event yet. On the 20th of February, Prime Minister Modi inaugurated the Chenab River Bridge. It's the world's highest railway bridge. It's taller than the Eiffel Tower. Now, last month, on the 12th of January, he inaugurated the Atal Setu, a 22-kilometer long bridge across Mumbai harbour. Now, one of India's biggest achievements over the last decade has been the explosive growth in infrastructure, the creation of resilient infrastructure like bridges, roads and airports that are powering India's economic growth. And all of this has got a focus like never before over the last decade. The government plans to spend over 96 lakh crore or over $1 trillion on infrastructure by the end of this decade to boost jobs and the economy. Krishna?
Right, that's right. And that spending that you're talking about over the next 6 years till the end of 2030 is more than double of what India as a country has spent on infrastructure over the course of the last 5 to 6 years since 2017. It's an important moment that we are in the middle of, and for two reasons. One is this big infrastructure push to all the physical infrastructure that we've been talking about, which is boards, ports and airports and bridges. And then, of course, the all-important digital public infrastructure as well. To talk about all of this and to understand all of this better, we have a couple of very special gentlemen joining us on the show. And one is, of course, editor of TV9's News9 Mediaverse, which is Mr. Rakesh Khar. Rakesh ji, thank you so much for taking time out. And of course, we have our good friend and colleague Kartik Malhotra as well joining us. Gentlemen, I want to begin with Rakesh ji. From Prime Minister's Gati Shakti to the great digital public infrastructure that India has developed, a model that the world should follow, from everything from UPI to FASTag. We are at the cusp of this infrastructure explosion, isn't it?
Absolutely, Krishna. We have to see it in two distinct modes. You rightly put it as two key buckets, but the kind of investment that this government has made in hard infrastructure, if I can call it, the digital infrastructure, I'll come in a minute.
Yes.
This is unprecedented. And the beauty about that is that you mentioned Chenab, Sandeep. The way the infrastructure has been built, the physical infrastructure has been built, has a very, very democratic approach to it. Yes. We do remember the railways as one big infrastructure spending over the decades post-independent India, but every spending by and large was linked to a political milestone. And not in this case the right milestone, it was the political address.
Right.
So if the railway minister happens to be from, say, a particular state, that state will have a massive skew. And what happened, once one started looking at the outcomes, there was essentially laying down of railway tracks, which were not followed up. So I think, as a country, we have phenomenally moved from that one big trajectory, and it's a paradigm shift indeed, that we have today a universal approach to growing both the urban and the urban and the city, infrastructure right down to the villages. So, repeatedly the Prime Minister has been talking about building 6.5 lakh villages with the same amount of intensity as we are building the Mumbai metro or the Delhi. Of course, in terms of the spending, there has been a gap there, and there's lots to catch up. But phenomenal focus on building this hard infrastructure, which has massive economic spin-offs. I call them the economic multipliers.
Yes.
We keep talking about them, essentially benefiting large, private sector players. But the spin-off is massive, because ultimately, even if it's a big ticket company, it is employing hundreds and thousands and lakhs of people to undertake and execute that project in time.
Yes.
And timeline management of projects with this particular government has been extremely rewarding. So in that sense, that multiplier effect goes down to the last mile. That is also one of the reasons there is a new defined economic labharthi here. One is the bottom of the pyramid labharthi. In this case, I call it the aspiring low middle class labharthi who is benefiting from this massive boost infrastructure. Of course, there are limits in to the investment that government can make in infrastructure. And I have repeatedly been arguing along with Kartik that the private sector has to kick in to at least match this, if not do it better. Ideally, they should do it better than that.
Mr. Khar, I want to ask you, since you have studied India's economic liberalization so closely for 33 years, this is the 33rd year since liberalization, how China did it was they built the infrastructure first and then simultaneously liberalized the economy. In our case, we are talking about roads, bridges, railway lines, airports 3 decades after they should have been done. Why? What explains this? Was this that political thing that you were talking of, that fragmented
No,
approach?
I would say that reform still continues to be one of the key landmarks in India's economic journey, and I would say even the political journey. Unfortunately, the politician who did it didn't get his credit. That is the former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao.
He finally did.
He finally
did this year with the Bharat Ratna.
Posthumous credit is no credit to my mind, but yes, in symbolism it did.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that India is not one homogeneous market.
Right.
It's not one homogeneous entity.
Yes.
Even today, we'll have to admit there are patches of huge growth.
Yes.
There are equally large swaths of land which are not yet developed.
Right.
So it's not going to be an overnight miracle that will change it.
Right.
And the model that we didn't follow rightly from China, I would say today, looking back, I mean, I was covering automobiles that time,
Yes.
working for the Pink Daily. The Chinese, when they opened a foreign direct investment, say for instance in auto, they first asked for a mandated investment in the auto components.
Right. Absolutely.
India brought in all the foreign players,
Yes.
Devus, we remember, they came in
the
and the
90s.
Cielo, the famous Cielo.
Yes.
And the result is that since we didn't follow that model, we have about 10 top global manufacturers exiting India.
Right.
So in the automobile sector, it isn't a great story to say because most of the manufacturers didn't find it, worthwhile to stay in
Right.
because, had we built a bottoms-up economy,
Right.
infrastructure in terms of the manufacturing base,
Yes.
probably the results would have been better in automobiles. Not that Indian automobile is not doing well,
Right.
but probably many more players versus 3 or 4 or 5 big players would have made a dramatic change in the way we imagine today our automobile landscape.
Right.
Okay. That's as far as the story, as far as physical infrastructure is concerned, Sandeep. And that's the reason why when we began this show, I also put in that all-important digital public infrastructure. Like
Absolutely.
you're pointing out, maybe we missed the bus, unlike China, which was developing its economy and infrastructure simultaneously.
Right.
But Kartik, when it comes to digital public infrastructure, India has certainly not missed the bus. India has in fact taken the lead. There is nothing like the UPI anywhere else in the world. And the entire India stack story per se, Kartik, isn't
No,
it?
you're right. I think, and there's something that we keep discussing, and there are enough and more newspaper headlines also that talk about the success of India stack, that talk about the success of DPI as a concept and the export potential of DPI. Now, I think unfortunately the narrative gets a little confused because when we get all excited about the fact that you can buy Eiffel Tower tickets using the UPI, unfortunately in France, in Paris, in Eiffel Tower, that ticket buying counter, it is still restricted only to Indians who have their UPI linked back to their accounts, who are traveling perhaps for tourism, who can scan and buy tickets. So technically, India has still not really exported that India stack architecture. And I think that is what is going to bring in the dollars. So while we are celebrating UPI, it's obviously a phenomenal model, and I think there is nothing like this anywhere in the world. But let's not forget, you also have, when you travel to London or if you travel to the US, you also have the Google Pay and the Apple Pay integrated on your smartwatch, where you don't even need to physically take out a phone, scan a QR code and walk out. NFC and other technologies permit you to just tap and go. So, we should pride ourselves with the great work that we have done from a cash denominated economy over the last 7-8 years, transforming ourselves into a digital payments economy. But let's not fool ourselves in believing that we are the only ones who are doing it. Okay. There are enough and more examples outside of India as well. More so in the developed stack, but even if you look at some African countries, you have the M-Pesa. M-Pesa has been as revolutionary for North Africa as the UPI has been for India. But there is obviously merit in exploring the possibility of exporting that architecture, because we are not linked only to a bank account using UPI. Our DPI covers a plethora of other tools as well. For example, unique identification, India's Aadhaar, or the unified identification of every citizen is something which is the bedrock of DPI. Add on that a unique mobile number linked to an Aadhaar card. That unique mobile number linked to X number of bank accounts owned by the same person who has the same Aadhaar, who has the same mobile number. So overall, this integration of DPI has been something that India has done better than anybody else. And when you talk about exporting the DPI story outside India, it's not likely to be limited to UPI alone. It has to be the entire India stack, and that is likely to draw in the dollar revenue.
If I can add to what Kartik said, we have to understand this DPI export in a very nuanced manner. It is more from the geopolitical perspective rather than the geoeconomic perspective. I'll explain how. The universe of services that UPI or the DPI offers is vastly different from any other country. For an example, our foreign affairs minister, he went with his son, he gave this example in one of his speeches. to a restaurant in US, and he was asked to produce the COVID certificate. His son produced a long physical document. This gentleman produced his phone, and it was scanned. That certificate was there. So, Kartik, to my mind, please correct me. The export is not about dollars. The export is about soft power, making a global impression.
Right.
And this India stack is going to travel first to emerging economies, which are doing much less better than India in terms of their per capita income. So I do see this particular infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, moving to countries where we are going to build this service as India's export without any commercial transaction to it.
But Rakesh, I think while I agree with you, there is
so there is a
potential
back end,
of soft
Kartik.
power,
No, there is a
soft power alone in the
yeah.
DPI story is unlikely to cut it, because at the end of the day, you want your own IT companies, you want the TCSs of the world and the Infosys and the HCLs of the world to actually implement this DPI internationally.
I was coming to that, Kartik. When you do it internationally, the bulk of the work today in the entire DPI infrastructure is being done by the government.
Correct. And NPCI, when you talk about
which
the financial, which is again government.
It is funded by the government. I do envision a very large ecosystem around this digital infrastructure, which has to come to the private sector, which hasn't yet happened.
It hasn't happened.
It is
It's a
essentially because
platform.
there is
It
a limit
provides a
again
platform for a variety of
limit to the
services.
way India government is going to subsidize all these services. Kartik has been making that point.
Right.
That's where the private sector, once we get bulk bookings, even if we are not paid there, as an entity, it's not an export in the export traditional sense, but those who are building that infrastructure will enable and enrich the financial ecosystem.
And while we're on this, I think, there's also ONDC. And when we talk about India's stack, I think that is another very critical element that we need to consider in our discussions. And again, ONDC, highly subsidized by the government. In fact, it is the government's pet project pretty much, with private players partaking in making it happen. But broadly, the ONDC story also continues to be a highly subsidized for the Indian economy delivery story, right?
Yes.
At the end of the day, you've got to make sure that these government subsidized products find an economic value of their own.
In fact,
there is a social value.
Kartik, I want to break for a quick interview with we did with IT Minister Ashwini Vaishnav. Just let's take a look at what he has to say about India's 5G and 6G dreams. Let's watch.
Basically, the industry has come out of its troubled times, of its difficult times. The way Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji has reformed the industry, the first major reform happened last September. Then there were 3 or 4 other major reforms which happened over last few months. For example, today a tower permission takes just few minutes, which used to take sometimes months. There were 400 odd crore paper applications lying which had to be audited, all kind of stuff was there. That's all gone. So many different things which PM Saab has reformed. It's the auction result is basically a reflection of those reforms. There are World Bank research reports that as telecom services are made available to people, the GDP multiplier is almost 1.5. So whatever investment goes in telecom services, they have a huge impact on the overall delivery of services. Take, for example, if there is a small handicraft maker somewhere in rural India, let's say somewhere in remote parts of Odisha, with good telecom services, that person would be able to showcase her products to a buyer in Europe, to a buyer in US. So those kind of things start happening. So competition is going to increase now. Question of duopoly doesn't arise because 1, reforms have happened. 2, BSNL has been given a very substantial revival package of 1,64,000 crore. 1,64,000 crore. A very properly laid out way forward for its growth. So BSNL will emerge as a big market stabilizer. So I think it's going to be future is going to see more players.
Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.